Research into the cause and cure of cancer is in the hands of a great medical establishment.
Ralph Moss was Assistant Public Relations Director of the Sloan Kettering Cancer Research Institute for 5 years. He wrote about Burton in his recent book, The Cancer Syndrome.
So I'd say that the problem is basically in the cancer establishment's attitudes and interests rather than in Lawrence Burton himself. I think there's a tendency in the big places to think that they are going to find the cure for cancer and to resent an upstart, such as a man from St. Vincent's Hospital or from the Bahamas who tells them anything about cancer. The field itself has its own limitations built in, and people who go outside the limitations become the heretics and the mavericks, such as Burton.
And as part of our ongoing series of looking at great books, we're going to be talking today about a book that originally came out in 1995 called Questioning Chemotherapy. And it's by a fascinating author, Ralph W. Moss, Ph.D. He's written 10 books. He's made 3 films, not all on the subject of cancer, but many of them. I believe we featured a book that he was involved in on an earlier recording. I just made the connection, An Alternative Approach to Allergies by Theron Randolph. But anyway, he's also the author of The Cancer Industry, Antioxidants Against Cancer, Cancer Therapy, The Independent Consumer's Guide. What else have we got here? Herbs Against Cancer, Customized Cancer Treatment. Here's an interesting one, Cancer Industry. Oh, Alternative Medicine Online. That's quite interesting. It's very expensive. The paperback is $111. But anyway, this book, Questioning Chemotherapy, is fascinating. Mr. Moss started out in the PR department of Sloan Kettering Hospital, which is sort of Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital. We've talked about them in previous recordings. If memory serves me, Memorial was funded by someone from the Kerr-McGee Corporation who decided that radium was since he had a whole bunch of it to sell, was the solution to all illnesses, including cancer. And if they were willing to take that line, he was willing to give them money. And even though it didn't work too well, they persisted. So as an employee of what later became known as Sloan Kettering, Mr. Moss was, basically, he started out as a PR guy, and he didn't see anything untoward at first. And then the longer he spent there, and the more he learned, and the more he observed, the more skeptical he became. And a big transition in his life took place when they moved. His offices were moved from 62nd Street to 68th Street. And his boss threw out a whole bunch of scrapbooks that had been gathering dust in the back room. And he said, well, gee, could I take those home for my kids? Because they could use them they could use the binders for their school reports. So as he began to clean out the newspaper clippings in these binders, he was caught by one story after another. Startling, he says. That summer, almost every evening, he stayed late, systematically reading and saving choice bits of the historical record of Memorial Sloan Kettering's publicity efforts. And then he started going to their archive, and then to a college library down the block. And what he discovered is that he had been hired to help publicize the latest breakthroughs in the war on cancer. But this scam of making it seem like there are breakthroughs and progress is being made, he discovered has been going on since the beginning, since the very earliest days. I'm just going to read straight from this. Sloan Kettering Institute, despite the obligatory lip service to humanitarianism, the focus of some researchers seemed to be on a high-paced game of new drug development. The patient, for some of them, was a pawn in the process of discovering and testing new agents that would boost their own careers and the profits of drug companies. So that's the game. The game has nothing to do with curing cancer. It has nothing to do with helping people. It has nothing to do with advancing science. What they're looking for are seemingly plausible things they can manufacture that cost a ton of money. And that's pretty much what it boils down to. Money for research was and continues to be scarce, no matter how much was pumped into the war on cancer. Scientists therefore sought out pharmaceutical and venture capital financing. This created an inevitable tendency to please their research sponsors. Normal, right? This impression has been confirmed by a more rigorous survey of clinical trials published in a medical journal. While 61% of drug studies in general reported results favorable to a new treatment, for studies supported by pharmaceutical companies, that number soared to 89%. So what does that mean? Someone's experimenting with a new drug, and if Big Pharma is underwriting it, lo and behold, 89% of the times it will come up promising. In other words, when the drug company is paying, 9 times out of 10, scientists will find something positive to say. Or they'll say nothing at all. And he goes on to say, as time went by, I learned that pharmaceutical companies active in the cancer field had assumed positions of great influence at Memorial Sloan Kettering and its subsidiary corporation. Overseers with fortunes from other sources went into the drug business and became even wealthier. Sound like Bill Gates, maybe. It was a tightening noose. Cancer was once seen as a dead end in medicine, and smart doctors hesitated to go into this specialty. But with the creation of the war on cancer, hundreds of millions of dollars were suddenly up for grabs. At around that time, I joined Memorial. Cancer research became a smart career move, bringing high salaries, academic prestige, and peer recognition. For a lucky few, it meant really big bucks. In the biotech field, cancer had become big business. The best that profit-oriented scientists at this institute could come up with were minor modifications of formulas whose patents were running out. Okay? So they had a moneymaker. They were about to lose their moneymaker. They tried to figure out a way to change the moneymaker slightly so that he could have another moneymaker. Nowhere in this equation is there any interest in health or healing. Other scientists were seeking ways to understand the chemical environment of the body. But the practical upshot turned out to be drugs, which enabled clinicians to give increasing amounts of standard toxic chemotherapy to their patients, usually with no appreciable improvement in survival. Now, he makes the point in the book that there are some limited cases, and you can read about them in this book and others, where chemotherapy may make sense. But in the vast majority of cases, it is a money-making scam for the drug companies, for the hospitals, and for the doctors. He doesn't go into this, but oncologists are the only doctors practicing who are allowed to profit personally and directly from the prescription of chemotherapy, and they make a lot of money at it. He also goes on to say so many things in this book, but the bottom line is while some cancers have declined, many of them are on the rise, and dramatically. Lung cancer among women up 548%. Malignant melanoma up 346%. Multiple myeloma up 205%. Prostate cancer up 189%. So this war, so-called war on cancer, is not doing too well. And of course, we know that a lot of cancer is coming from environmental causes. And that's the one thing they do not want to look at. They don't want to pull carcinogenic products from the market. And so what they do is they do this cleanup operation with the chemotherapy scam. So people are made sick, and then they are made poor and society is made poor by the drug companies and the doctors and the hospitals they work for. Now, interestingly enough, and he's got the guy that took over I'm just going through this book. Somebody very important in this whole thing is a guy named Cornelius Dusty Rhodes. He started out as the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service, leader of the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service. And then he became a rising star in cancer research. And he'd been a Rockefeller Foundation fellow and had been at Memorial Hospital before it turned into Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital. And he was the first head of research at that hospital. And he took a very sort of warlike approach to cancer. We were going to use super toxic drugs to kill the cancer. And how has that worked? Not too well. And so what they do is they hire PR people to pump up the stories, and that's how Mr. Moss first got involved in this. He realized that every 6 months or so they'd come out with a new bullshit story about how they were getting closer to a cure. We just need a little more money. We just need a little more money. Now, interestingly enough, the American Cancer Society was founded by a guy named Albert Lasker, who was an ad agency guy, like one of the best ever, one of the most effective ever. And he's the guy that convinced Americans to smoke on a large scale. And he was responsible for the Lucky Strikes campaigns that had doctors telling people how great it was to smoke. That actually doctors recommended smoking as a health practice. And he used his wisdom to whip up hysteria and fear about cancer and used that to raise endless amounts of money, supposedly for research, but of course a huge percentage of it went into management salaries, perks for managers, and so on. Now, people have been catching on and resisting this. They're realizing that this is a scam. However, if people that find themselves with cancer, a diagnosis, are immediately railroaded into chemotherapy because they don't want people to even have a day or two to start thinking about it or to start researching it or to read books like Questioning Chemotherapy. And one of the ways this whole thing goes is, in addition to endless PR and endless support of variations of chemotherapy drugs as opposed to real research, there's also attacks. And they are very good at organizing attacks on any doctor that would dare to question chemotherapy and its efficacy. Now, interestingly enough, studies have been done of oncologists themselves and how they feel about the very treatments that they give to their patients. And here we go on that section. It is also relevant to ask what oncologists themselves do when they get cancer. Do they believe in their own treatments so much that they take it themselves and recommend it for family members? I had reason to doubt it. I remember the story of a celebrated Sloan Kettering chemotherapist who, when he found out that he had advanced cancer, told his colleagues, quote, "Do anything you want, but no chemotherapy," end of quote. It was an open secret that an official of Sloan Kettering Institute sent his own mother to Germany for unconventional treatment rather than expose her to chemotherapy. However, while this has been kept pretty much under wraps and no studies of this, not many studies of this have been done, there was one really good study done in Canada where they studied the attitude of oncologists to the treatments that they were administering to patients, thereby enriching themselves. And here's that study. In 1986, McGill Cancer Center scientists sent a questionnaire to 118 doctors who treated non-small cell lung cancer. Of all of them were affiliated with the Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto or with the Ontario Cancer Research and Treatment Foundation, which operates 7 clinics throughout the province. More than 3/4 of them recruited patients and then helped carry out clinical trials for lung cancer. These Canadian specialists were asked to imagine that they themselves had a non-small cell lung cancer. And this cancer, by the way, is one that's treated commonly with toxic drugs. The doctors were asked which of 6 different randomized chemotherapy trials they would choose to enter. That's a whole other element. Not only do they railroad this treatment, ram it down people's throats without letting them do their own research first, they also use people as guinea pigs. People volunteer, but it's still a guinea pig situation. Here's what the doctors who are involved in the research, who see the results of these experiments, think about it. When it came to themselves, most specialists who treat lung cancer would not consent to participate as subjects in many of these trials, according to the Canadian survey. 64 out of 79 respondents, 81%, said they would not consent to be in a drug trial that contained the commonly used cisplatin, a drug noted for its chemical toxicity. And of these 64, 58 found all the proposed drug trials unacceptable. What was their reason? The ineffectiveness of chemotherapy and its unacceptable degree of toxicity. This is the opinion of the people in the business that make their living testing and administering these drugs to patients. Chemotherapy was uniformly unpopular regardless of the background and experience of the subjects. The more familiar these doctors were with particular treatments, the less likely they were to accept it for themselves. So how's that? So when oncologists get cancer, they're not rushing to chemotherapy or rushing people they care about to chemotherapy. They'll rush you into it. Okay. In March 1989, German biostatistician Dr. Ulrich Abel undertook his own systematic investigation of physicians' own choices in cancer treatment. He received 150 replies to a letter of inquiry sent to oncologists and research units around the world, trying to gauge these doctors' feelings about the use of chemotherapy in advanced carcinoma. Again, he's writing to oncologists about how they feel about what they do. Essentially, he reported, the personal views of many oncologists seem to be in striking contrast to communications intended for the public. In other words, they said one thing and they did another thing. So we could go on and on with this book, but I think the point has been made. And we've covered this in previous calls. There's something very shady about the cancer industry. And it is a major cash cow for the whole U.S. medical system. And it's designed to make money for researchers and their institutions and doctors and their hospitals, and most of all, big pharma and the manufacturers of chemotherapy agents. If you're not aware, chemotherapy is so dangerous that doctors and nurses have to be trained in its handling to prevent them from getting gravely ill from handling it. It has to be disposed of with great care. It is a serious, it's not one thing, it's many, many different things, but these things are serious, deadly toxins. And, how they became the standard of care for all cancers in every case, for every person, is something, quite mind-boggling, unless you understand how the system's put together. So the book, again, is Questioning Chemotherapy, Ralph Moss, and he's got a lot of great books, and I strongly recommend that you look into his work.